He was a wayfarer, and it was all he knew. That and a single sentence that rang in his ears. "How do you see the world, little one?" He stood waiting patiently on the outskirts of the coastal village. He'd traveled so far and endured any number of ordeals to arrive at this place. A little more patience would only do him good. Besides, his attention was presently focused on the brilliant pathway of stars that stretched from a narrow band to the east to a broad spectrum of light in the west. The pathway began on the eastern horizon with a bright cluster of stars shaped like a wheel, out of which tendrils stretched. He took in the scene to the accompaniment of dozens of humming, stick-like insects. He'd seen them earlier during the daylight, and was astonished to see their compound eyes flicker on and off as twilight gave way to night. There were too many distractions to become lost in, but he always meandered rather than follow the straight and narrow path. That couldn't be entirely wrong. After all, it brought him here. Even if here was soon to vanish precisely because of his arrival. He couldn't tell why or how he knew this, he just did. Yet he knew little else. It seemed as though the ones he waited on knew considerably more about him, a harbinger of bad things to come. The one who found him wandering said as much as soon as she spotted the hair growing from his face, and the strange eye, as she said, though he didn't quite know what that meant. The ones he waited on, the assembled elders, keepers of the knowledge, storytellers, hotly debated his arrival and the disastrous consequences it meant for them. There were 10 in total, and while they may not know him, they knew what he represented, and they wept. He wished he could have been there to reassure them, but he knew this was not the case. His arrival meant the end of everything. So they convened to discuss the matter inside a large, dome-like hut. That was a day earlier, when he'd been told to wait outside until he was told otherwise. It would have been bearable if he was free to move around, but even that was prohibited, at least in daylight. Nobody was to know of his presence, and so he waited. He finally stepped from a covering of locust trees when the sun sank into the west and the 2 full moons lit the night. "There's life there," he whispered under his breath. Distinct white swaths of cloud marked about 2/3 of each moon. Ice caps covered portions of the north and south poles, and the ever-remarkable blue-green patterns of water and land marked the rest of the spheres. So he stood there watching the discreet journey as it began just above the northeast horizon to their resting place in the southeast. They eventually disappeared once more, allowing the brilliant path of stars their prominence. He thought to himself, all of their stories are up there. While he could barely determine the potential lines that indicated form between the points of light, they were living maps of the universe to the old men and women inside that hut. Earlier, when he remained hidden in the locust trees, he heard the sound of young men, women, and children not too far off. They must also know of stories that occur up there. Some of them, young lovers or lone sentries, likely out on a warm rock overlooking the ocean, likely looked up just as he did that very night. He imagined they must have done this on that same rock for countless generations. Yet his arrival signaled this would cease forever. He was creative, though, and already he was thinking of ways he could influence the course of events so that the end didn't necessarily equal absolute. He got the idea as he lay hidden in the locust trees, looking up at the strange, stick-like insect that was nearly invisible for the bark beneath it. He knew well enough to pay attention to the signs, especially those that seemed peculiar, yet insignificant. This, he determined, was anything but insignificant. A thin, gossamer-like thread, seemingly formed from the very air, linking the long, stick insect to another branch some distance away. How could this happen? He asked himself. He'd never seen an insect do that. And afterwards, when the insect had crossed over to the opposite branch, he gently touched the gossamer thread it traveled. It dispersed to the touch, turning to dust. The insect took notice and measured him in return with its large compound eyes. "How do you see the world, little one?" he asked. He imagined the insects must see light as he saw clouds, the filaments of density that, although lacking physical texture, did contain an ever-evolving and shifting form. He reached his finger out to allow the insect to climb onto his hand. The soft pads on the ends of its 6 stick legs felt warm to the touch. He stared at the eyes, which reflected the canopy above. "You must feed off the light, right, little one?" The insect remained quiet, but the warmth that emanated from its pads confirmed in his mind that light filled this insect through its eyes. This was further confirmed when he saw the insect's eyes flicker on and off in its form of interspecies communication. Indeed, he could become lost in the wonders of this new world, and indeed he would have, had it not been for the occasional commotion emerging from inside that hut.